The fluorescent lights in the courthouse hallway buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that made everyone look like they were dying. I sat on the hard wooden bench, my hands trembling as I stared at the marble floor beneath my feet. The sound of expensive heels clicking against the stone echoed through the corridor, each step a reminder that this wasn't just another family dispute, this was the end of everything I thought I knew about my life. My name is Ryan, and 3 hours ago, I walked into Courtroom 4B thinking I was going to settle a simple misunderstanding about my college fund. I walked out knowing that my parentes, the people who raised me for 22 years, considered me dead to them. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in downtown Chicago. October wind whipped through the streets, carrying the scent of Lake Michigan and the promise of an early winter. I'd taken the red line from my cramped studio apartment in Logan Square, dressed in the only suit I owned, a navy blue hand-me-down from my father that hung slightly loose on my shoulders. Mom had always said I needed to fill out more, that I was too skinny for my own good. The irony of wearing his suit to face them in court wasn't lost on me. The whole thing had begun 6 months earlier when I'd made what I thought was a reasonable request. I wanted to use my college fund money that had been set aside for my education since I was born to pay for graduate school. Not just any graduate school, but a master's program in social work at Northwestern. I wanted to help kids who'd grown up like I had, in families where love came with conditions and expectations felt more like chains. My parents, Robert and Linda Mitchell, had different plans. They wanted me to use the money for law school. Their dream, not mine. When I refused, they threatened to cut me off entirely. When I stood my ground, they made good on that threat. Ryan Mitchell? A court clerk appeared at my side, her voice cutting through my thoughts. Judge Morrison is ready to see all parties now. I stood on unsteady legs, smoothing down my tie, a burgundy one my grandmother had given me for my high school graduation. It was the only thing I was wearing that hadn't come from my parents, and I clung to that small act of rebellion like a lifeline. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood-paneled walls and rows of empty benches. At the front, Judge Morrison sat behind his bench, a stern-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. To the right sat my parents with their lawyer, James Patterson, a man who'd been to every birthday party and Christmas dinner for as long as I could remember. Now he wouldn't even meet my eyes. My own lawyer, Susan Torres, was a public defender who'd taken my case pro bono. She was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a fierce determination that reminded me why I'd chosen social work over law. She told me from the beginning that this was going to be ugly, that family court often brought out the worst in people. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't. Your Honor, Patterson began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms, my clients, Robert and Linda Mitchell, are here today to formalize the revocation of their financial support for their son, Ryan Mitchell, and to legally dissolve any future financial obligations. The words hit me like physical blows. Financial obligations. As if 22 years of being their son could be reduced to a line item in a budget. The defendant, Patterson continued, and I flinched at hearing myself called that, has repeatedly defied his parents' guidance and has chosen a path that goes against their values and expectations. My clients believe that continued financial support would only enable what they consider to be irresponsible behavior. Judge Morrison looked at me over his glasses. Mr. Mitchell, you're 22 years old. Why exactly are you here fighting for access to money your parents control? I cleared my throat, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended. Your Honor, this isn't just money. This is a college fund that was set up specifically for my education. I'm not asking for spending money or a handout. I want to use it for exactly what it was intended for, to further my education. In a field they don't approve of, Patterson interjected. Objection, Susan said sharply. The original trust documents make no mention of parental approval being required for educational choices. Sustained, Judge Morrison said, but his tone suggested this was more of a formality than anything else. My father stood up then, his tall frame imposing even in the sterile courtroom environment. Robert Mitchell was a successful insurance executive, the kind of man who commanded boardrooms and never raised his voice because he never had to. When he spoke, people listened. Your Honor, if I may, he said, his voice steady and controlled. This isn't about money. This is about responsibility. About making choices that lead to a stable future. My son wants to throw away his potential to become what amounts to a glorified babysitter. The words stung because they were delivered without any anger, without any emotion at all. Just cold, calculated dismissal of everything I cared about. Robert, my mother said softly, placing a hand on his arm. Linda Mitchell was a school principal, a woman who'd built her career on understanding children and helping them succeed. The fact that she couldn't or wouldn't understand her own son felt like the deepest betrayal of all. She stood as well, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 22 years of disappointment. Your Honor, we've given Ryan every opportunity. Private schools, tutoring, college preparation courses. We've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in his future. And he wants to use that investment to pursue a career that will barely allow him to support himself, let alone a family. So you're cutting him off entirely? Judge Morrison asked. My father's jaw tightened. We're ending our financial support, yes. Sometimes, Your Honor, the kindest thing a parent can do is to stop enabling their child's mistakes. I felt something break inside my chest. Not just hurt, I'd been hurt before. This was something deeper, more fundamental. It was the sound of a door slamming shut, of bridges burning behind me. Your Honor, I said, my voice stronger now, fueled by anger I didn't know I possessed. They're not just cutting off financial support. They're trying to make it so I can't access money that was specifically set aside for my education. Money that came from my grandmother's estate when I was 10 years old. Patterson was on his feet immediately. That money was placed in trust with Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell as trustees, with full discretionary power over its use. For educational purposes, Susan countered. The trust clearly states. The trust gives the trustees discretionary power to determine what constitutes appropriate educational use, Patterson shot back. My clients have determined that financing a degree in social work does not meet their standards for appropriate use. Judge Morrison held up a hand. I've reviewed the trust documents. Mr. Patterson is correct. The trustees have broad discretionary power. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw something that might have been sympathy. Mr. Mitchell, I understand this is difficult, but legally your parents have the right to control how this money is used. The room started to spin. 22 years of being the perfect son, of getting good grades and staying out of trouble and following their rules, and it all came down to this. A legal technicality that meant they could take away not just their love but my future. However, Judge Morrison continued, there is one avenue available to you. You could petition the court to remove your parents as trustees and appoint an independent trustee who would evaluate your educational plans without personal bias. No, my father said sharply. Absolutely not. Robert, my mother said, her voice warning. But my father was past the point of measured responses. No, Linda. I will not stand by and watch him destroy his life with our money. He turned to face me directly for the first time since we'd entered the courthouse. You want to be independent, Ryan? You want to make your own choices? Then make them with your own money. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Patterson looked uncomfortable, and Susan was scribbling furiously on her legal pad. My mother stood slowly, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Ryan, honey, it doesn't have to be this way. Come home. Apply to law school. Use the money the way it was intended. The way you intended, I said. Not the way I intended. Not the way Grandma intended when she left it for my education. Your grandmother wanted you to be successful, my father said coldly. She wanted you to have opportunities we never had. And I want to take those opportunities. Just not the ones you've chosen for me. That's when my father said the words that would replay in my head for years to come. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather or quarterly earnings. Then you're no longer our child. The words hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and suffocating. My mother gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth, but she didn't contradict him. She didn't take it back. Robert, she whispered, but it was too late. You heard me, he continued, his eyes never leaving mine. If you choose this path, if you deliberately throw away everything we've worked to give you, then you're choosing to walk away from this family. And we're choosing to let you go. I felt like I was drowning, like the air had been sucked out of the room. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about everything: love, acceptance, belonging. All of it conditional on my willingness to live their dream instead of my own. Your Honor, Susan said, her voice cutting through the emotional chaos, I'd like to request a brief recess. But I was already standing, already moving toward the door. I couldn't breathe in that room, couldn't think with their words echoing in my ears. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Morrison called after me, but I was already pushing through the heavy courtroom doors. I made it to the men's room before I threw up, my body rejecting not just the stress of the morning but the entire reality of what had just happened. When I finally emerged, splashing cold water on my face and avoiding my own eyes in the mirror, Susan was waiting for me. Ryan, she said gently, I know that was brutal, but we're not done yet. Judge Morrison is willing to hear arguments about appointing an independent trustee. Did you hear what he said? I asked, my voice hoarse. He said I'm not their child anymore. He was angry. People say things they don't mean when. He meant it, I interrupted. You didn't see his face. He meant every word. Susan studied me for a long moment, and I could see her making calculations, weighing legal strategies against human realities. What do you want to do? I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, 22 years old, wearing my father's suit and my grandmother's tie, caught between the person I was raised to be and the person I wanted to become. I want to go back in there and fight, I said finally. If I'm not their child anymore, then I don't need their approval. I just need what's legally mine. When we returned to the courtroom, my parents were huddled with Patterson, their conversation stopping abruptly when they saw me. My father's face was stone, but my mother's eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from anger or sadness I couldn't tell. Your Honor, Susan began, my client would like to formally petition the court to remove Robert and Linda Mitchell as trustees of the Education Trust and appoint an independent trustee to oversee the distribution of funds for legitimate educational expenses. On what grounds? Patterson demanded. Breach of fiduciary duty and personal bias preventing proper execution of trust responsibilities. The legal arguments that followed blurred together in a haze of objections and counter-objections, citations and precedents. But what I remember most clearly was my mother's face as Susan laid out our case, the way her composure cracked a little more with each argument. When it was over, Judge Morrison took less than 10 minutes to make his decision. In the matter of the Mitchell Educational Trust, I find that the current trustees have allowed personal disagreement with the beneficiaries' educational choices to interfere with their fiduciary duties. The trust was established for educational purposes, and a degree in social work from an accredited institution clearly falls within those parameters. My heart started to race. Therefore, I am removing Robert and Linda Mitchell as trustees and appointing the court to oversee the appointment of an independent trustee who will evaluate Mr. Ryan Mitchell's educational plans without personal bias. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the small courtroom. I had won, but the victory felt hollow, bitter in my mouth. My parents sat in stunned silence for a moment before my father stood abruptly. Come on, Linda, he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. We're done here. My mother hesitated, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't read. For a moment, I thought she might say something, might try to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. Instead, she followed my father out of the courtroom without a word. I sat there for a long time after everyone else had left, staring at the empty judge's bench and trying to process what had just happened. I had gotten what I wanted: access to my education fund, the freedom to pursue social work, independence from my parents' expectations. So why did it feel like I had lost everything that mattered? Susan found me there an hour later, still sitting in the empty courtroom. Ryan? The courthouse is about to close. They really meant it, I said, more to myself than to her. They're really done with me. Maybe, she said, sitting down beside me. Or maybe they just need time to process this. Parents don't always handle their children's independence well, especially when it comes suddenly. Suddenly? I laughed bitterly. I've been trying to talk to them about my plans for 2 years. They just never listened. Sometimes the hardest thing about growing up is realizing that our parents are just people, Susan said quietly. Flawed people who make mistakes and let their fears control their decisions. I turned to look at her. Is that supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to help you understand that this isn't necessarily the end of the story, she replied. People can change. Relationships can heal. But first, you need to focus on building the life you want. Show yourself that you made the right choice. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, the October wind cutting through my father's suit, I had no idea how prophetic Susan's words would be. I thought the story was over, that the worst was behind me. I was wrong. 3 days later, everything would change again when a phone call would force me to confront truths about my family that I never could have imagined. Truths that would make the events in that courtroom seem like just the opening chapter of a much larger, more complex story. But that Tuesday afternoon, walking away from the courthouse with my victory that felt like defeat, all I could think about was my grandmother's tie around my neck and the question that would haunt me for months to come. If I was no longer their child, then who exactly was I? 3 days. That's how long I had to believe that walking out of that courtroom was the end of my relationship with my parents. 3 days to start imagining what my life would look like without family dinners on Sundays, without my mother's worried phone calls asking if I was eating enough, without my father's grudging pride when I accomplished something he could brag about to his colleagues. 3 days to realize that freedom, the kind I'd fought so hard for, felt a lot like loneliness. I was sitting in my studio apartment on Friday evening, surrounded by graduate school applications and the remnants of a takeout dinner I'd barely touched, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. I almost didn't answer it. Hello? Is this Ryan Mitchell? The voice was professional, female, with a slight southern accent that didn't quite fit with the Chicago number. Yes, this is Ryan. Mr. Mitchell, my name is Patricia Hawthorne. I'm calling from the law offices of Hawthorne, Blackwell and Associates. I was wondering if you might have some time to meet with me this week regarding the estate of Eleanor Mitchell. My grandmother. My father's mother, who had died when I was 10 years old. The woman whose college fund money my parents had just lost control of in court. I'm sorry, I said, setting down the application I'd been reviewing. Is there some issue with the trust? Because my lawyer already handled the trustee situation and… Mr. Mitchell, Patricia interrupted gently, this isn't about the education trust. This is about your grandmother's will. Her actual will. Something cold settled in my stomach. Her will was read 12 years ago. Everything was settled then. I'm afraid not everything was settled, no? There were additional provisions that only recently came into effect. Provisions that specifically concern you. I stood up, pacing to the window that looked out over the narrow alley behind my building. A cat was picking through garbage, methodical and determined. I felt like I was looking at my own life. What kind of provisions? The kind that would be better discussed in person, Mr. Mitchell. Would you be available to come to our office tomorrow morning? Say 10 o'clock? Every instinct I had told me to hang up the phone. The past week had been enough legal drama to last me a lifetime, and I wasn't sure I could handle another revelation about my family. But something in Patricia Hawthorne's voice, a careful professionalism that suggested she was holding back significant information, made me curious despite myself. I'll be there, I said. Excellent. We're located at 200 North LaSalle Street, 42nd floor. Ask for me specifically at the reception desk. After she hung up, I spent the next hour researching Hawthorne, Blackwell and Associates online. What I found made my apartment seem even smaller and shabbier by comparison. They were one of Chicago's most prestigious estate planning firms, the kind of place that managed the fortunes of old Chicago money and charged more for a consultation than I made in a month waiting tables. What could my grandmother possibly have left unfinished with a firm like that? I called Susan Torres, but it went to voicemail. I thought about calling my parents, then remembered that they'd made it clear I was no longer their child. Instead, I spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling and trying to remember everything I could about my grandmother. Eleanor Mitchell had been a formidable woman, the kind of person who wore pearls to grocery shop and treated every conversation like a negotiation. She died of a heart attack when I was 10, sudden and unexpected, and I remembered my father crying at her funeral, one of the only times I'd ever seen him show that kind of emotion. What I remembered most about her, though, was how she used to talk to me like I was already grown up, asking my opinions about things and listening to my answers as if they mattered. She was the one who'd encouraged my interest in helping people, who told me stories about her own father's work with immigrant families during the Depression. The measure of a person isn't what they accomplish for themselves, she used to say, but what they do to make the world a little better for someone else. Maybe that was why her money had meant so much to me, why fighting my parents for access to it had felt like more than just a financial dispute. It was the last connection I had to someone who had understood who I wanted to be. The offices of Hawthorne, Blackwell and Associates occupied an entire floor of a gleaming downtown tower, all marble and mahogany and the kind of understated luxury that screamed serious money. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with perfect posture and a smile that revealed nothing, directed me to a conference room where Patricia Hawthorne was waiting. Patricia turned out to be a woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked auburn hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. She rose from her seat as I entered, extending a hand that was firm and surprisingly warm. Mr. Mitchell, thank you for coming on such short notice. Please have a seat. The conference room had a view of Lake Michigan that probably cost more in rent than most people made in a year. I tried not to gawk as I settled into a leather chair that probably cost more than my entire apartment's furnishings. Can I offer you some coffee? Water? I'm fine, thank you. I wasn't, but I wanted to get to the point. You said this was about my grandmother's will? Patricia nodded, opening a thick file folder. Your grandmother was a very forward-thinking woman, Mr. Mitchell. When she created her estate plan, she included provisions that wouldn't activate until certain conditions were met. What kind of conditions? Age-related conditions primarily. You've recently turned 22, correct? In September, yes. Then you've met the first condition. Patricia pulled out a document that looked official and intimidating. Mr. Mitchell, I need to ask you some personal questions, and I need you to answer them honestly. The integrity of your grandmother's wishes depends on it. I nodded, though I had no idea what I was agreeing to. Are you currently estranged from your parents? The question hit me like a physical blow. How could she possibly know about what had happened in court? Yes. As of this week, yes. Patricia made a note on a legal pad. And this estrangement, is it related to your educational or career choices? How do you know about that? Your grandmother was very specific about the conditions under which certain provisions of her will would take effect. She anticipated that there might come a time when your parents' expectations would conflict with your own values and goals. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. She knew? 12 years ago, she knew this would happen. Your grandmother understood your father very well, Mr. Mitchell. She loved him, but she also recognized his limitations. And she remembered what it was like to be a young person with dreams that didn't match your family's expectations. Patricia pulled out another document, this one sealed with red wax. She left very specific instructions about when this was to be opened and read. Those conditions have now been met. With careful precision, she broke the seal and unfolded what appeared to be a handwritten letter. Even from across the table, I could recognize my grandmother's elegant script, the same handwriting that had adorned birthday cards and Christmas gifts throughout my childhood. This is a letter addressed to you, Mr. Mitchell, to be read in the event that you found yourself estranged from your parents due to conflicts over your life choices. Would you like me to read it aloud, or would you prefer to read it yourself? My hands were shaking as I reached for the letter. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind my grandmother had always used for important correspondence. Her handwriting was as clear and decisive as I remembered. My dearest Ryan, if you are reading this letter, then several things have come to pass. You have reached your 22nd birthday. You have chosen to pursue a path in life that serves others rather than simply serving yourself. And most importantly, you have discovered that your parents' love, though real, comes with conditions that you cannot in good conscience accept. I am not surprised by any of these developments. I raised your father, and I know both his strengths and his limitations. Robert is a good man who wants the best for you, but his understanding of the best is narrow and rooted in his own fears about security and social standing. Your mother, bless her, loves you deeply but has never learned to stand up to your father when it matters most. I want you to know, my dear boy, that I am proud of the choice you have made. It takes courage to disappoint the people we love in service of becoming the person we're meant to be. I did the same thing at your age, much to my own parents' horror, when I chose to marry your grandfather despite their objections. They wanted me to marry the banker's son, a man who would have given me security and respectability and absolutely no happiness whatsoever. Instead, I married a man who taught immigrant children to read English and who believed that a life spent in service to others was the only life worth living. We were poor for many years, but we were rich in ways that mattered. Your grandfather died young, as you know, but the work he started continued through me, and I hope it will continue through you. Which brings me to the matter at hand. I looked up at Patricia, my vision blurring with tears I hadn't expected. There's more? Oh, Mr. Mitchell, Patricia said softly, we've only just begun. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. Ryan, the education trust that your parents controlled was never the extent of what I left for you. It was, in fact, the smallest part of my estate. I created that trust knowing that your parents would use it as leverage, would try to control your choices through it. I wanted them to believe they held all the cards so that when the time came for you to be truly independent, the revelation would be complete. The bulk of my estate, my investments, my property holdings, and yes, the family home that your parents believed they inherited was placed in a separate trust with instructions that it only be revealed to you under very specific circumstances. Those circumstances have now been met. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. This can't be right. Patricia was watching me carefully. Keep reading, Mr. Mitchell. You are now the sole beneficiary of the Eleanor Mitchell Charitable Trust, which holds assets valued at approximately $2.8 million as of the time I'm writing this letter. The trust has been growing for 12 years, so I imagine the amount is considerably larger now. There are conditions, of course. The money must be used to further education, your own and others. You may use it to pay for your graduate studies, but you must also establish a scholarship program for students from low-income families who want to pursue careers in social service. The house on Maple Street, the house where your father grew up and where you spent so many holidays, is also yours, though your parents have been living in it under the assumption that they inherited it. I know this will cause difficulty, my dear boy. Your parents will be shocked and hurt, and they may try to fight this legally. The trust was structured very carefully to prevent that, but family wounds can sometimes prove more persistent than legal documents. My hope is that this revelation will serve not just as your financial independence, but as an opportunity for healing. Your parents love you, Ryan, even if they have a poor way of showing it. Sometimes people need to lose something precious before they understand its true value. Use this gift wisely. Help others as you have always wanted to do. Build the life you've dreamed of, not the one others have planned for you. And remember that sometimes the greatest gift we can give our family is the courage to be ourselves, even when it disappoints them. All my love and faith in your future, your grandmother Eleanor. P.S. Check the basement of the Maple Street house. Behind the old coal furnace, you'll find a metal box containing documents and photographs that will help you understand why I made these choices. Your family history is more complex and more beautiful than your father has ever told you. I set the letter down with trembling hands and stared out at Lake Michigan, trying to process what I'd just read. $2.8 million 12 years ago. The house my parents lived in. A complete reversal of everything I thought I knew about my family's finances and my own future. How much? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Patricia consulted another document. As of yesterday's valuation, the trust holds $4.7 million in liquid assets, plus the property on Maple Street, which is valued at approximately $800,000. $5.5 million. Plus change, yes. I started to laugh, a sound that was part hysteria and part disbelief. 3 days ago, my parents cut me off and told me I wasn't their child anymore because I wanted to use my college fund for social work. Now you're telling me I'm a millionaire? Yes, Mr. Mitchell, that's exactly what I'm telling you. The implications started hitting me in waves. The house my parents lived in wasn't theirs. The money they thought they'd inherited from my grandmother, money they'd been living on, money that had paid for their comfortable lifestyle for the past 12 years, that money was supposed to have been held in trust for me. Do they know? I asked. My parents, do they know about any of this? Patricia shook her head. Your grandmother's instructions were very clear. This information was only to be shared with you, and only after the specified conditions were met. How and when you choose to share it with your family is entirely up to you. But they've been living in that house for 12 years thinking it's theirs. Yes, they have. The trust has been paying all the taxes and maintenance costs, which they've assumed were coming from a different part of your grandmother's estate. I thought about my parents' comfortable suburban life, the way they'd never seemed to worry about money despite my father's middle management salary. The expensive vacations, the private schools, the country club membership that had always seemed slightly beyond their means. It had all been funded by money that was meant for me. What happens now? I asked. Patricia pulled out another set of documents. Now you have some decisions to make. First, you need to decide whether to accept the inheritance. I know that sounds like a strange question, but given the family dynamics involved, you need to be absolutely certain you're prepared for the consequences. What consequences? Your parents will have to be informed that the house they've been living in doesn't belong to them, that the comfortable lifestyle they've been enjoying was funded by your inheritance, and that their assumption about what they inherited from your grandmother was incorrect. That's going to be a difficult conversation. I thought about my father's voice in the courtroom, "You're no longer our child." I thought about my mother's silence, her refusal to contradict him. They made their choice, I said quietly. They chose to prioritize their expectations over their relationship with me. I can't live my life worried about protecting them from the consequences of their own decisions. Patricia nodded approvingly. That's a very mature perspective, Mr. Mitchell. But I want you to understand, accepting this inheritance will change your life completely. Not just financially, but in terms of your relationships, your responsibilities, and your future. Are you prepared for that? I looked out at the lake again, thinking about the past week, about everything that had led me to this moment. A week ago, I'd been a broke graduate student fighting for access to a college fund. Today, I was apparently a millionaire with the power to completely upend my family's life. Yes, I said finally. I'm prepared. Patricia smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since I'd arrived. Then let's begin the paperwork. And Mr. Mitchell? Your grandmother would be very proud of you. As I signed document after document, transferring millions of dollars into my name and accepting responsibility for my family's house, I kept thinking about my grandmother's final words in her letter. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give our family is the courage to be ourselves, even when it disappoints them. I had no idea yet what I was going to do with this money, this house, this complete transformation of my circumstances. But I knew one thing for certain: I was going to use it to build the life I wanted, not the one my parents had planned for me. And maybe, just maybe, It would help me understand who I really was now that I was no longer their child but apparently their landlord. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to cut me off from their money, my parents had inadvertently led me to discover that I didn't need their money at all. I had my own. I just wasn't sure what that was going to mean for any of us. I sat in my car outside the house on Maple Street for 20 minutes before I found the courage to get out. It was a crisp November afternoon, the kind where the bare branches of the old oak trees looked like ink sketches against the gray sky. The house looked exactly as it had every Christmas and Thanksgiving of my childhood: red brick, white shutters, a wraparound porch that my grandmother had loved to sit on during summer evenings. It was strange to think that this house, where I'd spent countless holidays and summer visits, where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway and helped my grandmother plant roses by the front steps, actually belonged to me now. Had always belonged to me in a way even when I didn't know it. My parents' car wasn't in the driveway. Patricia had called them the day before to schedule this meeting, identifying herself only as an attorney who needed to discuss some estate matters. They probably thought it had something to do with the court case, some final paperwork related to the trust fund dispute. They had no idea what was coming. I used the key that Patricia had given me, my grandmother's key, which had been held by the law firm all these years. It felt surreal to walk into what had been my parents' home uninvited, but legally, I reminded myself, they were the ones who had been living here uninvited. The house smelled the same as always: my mother's vanilla candles, the lingering scent of my father's coffee, and underneath it all, something that had always been purely my grandmother, a combination of rose soap and old books that had never quite faded from the rooms where she'd lived. I made my way to the basement, following my grandmother's instructions from the letter. The basement had always been my father's domain, a finished space with wood paneling and a bar where he'd entertained his friends during football games. But in the far corner, behind the old coal furnace that hadn't been used in decades, I found what my grandmother had left for me. The metal box was exactly where she'd said it would be, hidden behind a loose panel in the wall. Inside, I found documents, photographs, and letters that told a story about my family that I'd never heard before. My grandmother hadn't just married my grandfather against her parents' wishes because he was poor. She'd married him because he was the son of Italian immigrants, because he spoke broken English and worked with his hands, and because her wealthy Protestant family considered him beneath their social station. The photographs showed a young woman who looked remarkably like my mother, standing next to a dark-haired man with kind eyes and calloused fingers. My grandfather, who I'd never known, had died in an industrial accident when my father was only 8 years old. But there were other documents in the box that made my hands shake as I read them. Letters from my grandfather's family, written in a mixture of broken English and Italian, thanking my grandmother for the money she sent to help them immigrate to America. Records showing that she had quietly funded the education of dozens of immigrant children over the decades. Bank statements revealing that most of her substantial inheritance from her own wealthy family had been spent on scholarships, community programs, and helping families get started in America. There was a letter she'd written but never sent, addressed to my father on his 18th birthday. My dear Robert, I know you are ashamed of your father's background, ashamed of the poverty we lived in when you were young, ashamed of the accent he never quite lost and the way people looked down on our family. You've spent your teenage years trying to distance yourself from where you came from, and I understand that impulse. But I hope someday you'll understand that your father's greatest gift to you wasn't the social status you wish he'd had, but his belief that every person deserves dignity and opportunity, regardless of where they started. You are becoming a man who values security above all else, and I don't blame you for that. You've seen what it's like to worry about money, to be looked down upon by people who think they're better than you. But I hope you don't let that fear control your entire life. I hope you don't pass that fear on to your children. Your father died trying to build something better for our family. Don't let his sacrifice be wasted by living a life ruled by fear. Love, Mother. I sat on the basement floor surrounded by photographs and documents, finally understanding why my grandmother had structured her will the way she had. She'd seen my father become exactly what she'd feared, a man so focused on security and social acceptance that he'd lost sight of the values his own father had died trying to provide. And she'd seen me struggling against those same expectations, trying to honor the legacy of service and compassion that had been the real inheritance she wanted to pass down. The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway brought me back to the present. I quickly gathered the documents and photographs, putting everything back in the metal box and carrying it upstairs with me. By the time my parents walked through the front door, I was sitting in the living room, the box on the coffee table in front of me. Ryan. My mother's voice was surprised, confused. What are you doing here? How did you get in? My father appeared behind her, his face already hard with suspicion. I thought we made our position clear in court. You did, I said, standing up. You made it very clear that I'm no longer your child. But there are some things we need to discuss. If this is about the trust fund, there's nothing to discuss, my father said. The court made its decision. You got what you wanted. This isn't about the trust fund, Dad. This is about Grandma's will. Her actual will. My mother frowned. Ryan, your grandmother's will was settled years ago. Everything was handled by the estate lawyer when she died. Not everything, I said. Sit down. Please. Both of you. There was something in my voice that made them comply, though my father remained stiff and defensive. I opened the metal box and pulled out my grandmother's letter, the one she'd written to me. Before I explain what's in this box, I need you to understand something. I didn't go looking for this. I didn't scheme or manipulate or try to take anything away from you. This came to me because of conditions that Grandma set up 12 years ago. What conditions? My mother asked. I looked at my father. Conditions that would be met if you ever chose to disown me because of my life choices. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. My father's face had gone pale, and my mother was staring at me with growing alarm. She knew, I continued. Somehow she knew this day would come. She knew that your fears about security and social status would eventually put you in conflict with my desire to help people. And she planned for it. I handed my mother the letter. Read it. Both of you. I watched their faces as they read, saw my father's expression change from suspicion to shock to something that might have been devastation. My mother's hands were trembling by the time she finished. This can't be real, my father said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's real, I said. I've spent the past 3 days with lawyers, going through paperwork and asset valuations. The trust fund you fought me over? It was nothing compared to what she actually left me. The house you're living in, the money you thought you inherited, it was all being held for me, waiting for the day when you decided I wasn't good enough to be your son. My mother set the letter down with shaking hands. Ryan, we never said you weren't good enough. We just wanted you to be secure, to have a good life. You wanted me to have your definition of a good life, I corrected. Even if it meant crushing everything I actually cared about. My father was staring at the wall, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion. So what now? You're here to kick us out of our home? To punish us for trying to guide you away from a mistake? I'm here, I said, because despite everything that happened in that courtroom, you're still my parents. And because Grandma hoped that this moment might be an opportunity for healing instead of more hurt. I pulled out some of the photographs and documents from the box. Did you know that your father's family thanked Grandma every Christmas for 20 years because she helped bring them to America? Did you know she funded the education of over 50 immigrant children? Did you know she spent most of her inheritance on scholarship programs and community support? My father glanced at the photographs, and I saw something break in his expression. She never told me any of this. Because you were so ashamed of where you came from that she didn't think you'd understand, I said. Because you'd spent your whole adult life trying to distance yourself from your father's background. That's not, he started, then stopped. He died in a factory accident, Ryan. He was killed because the safety regulations weren't enforced, because immigrant workers were considered expendable. I didn't want that life for myself or for you. And look how that turned out, I said. You became so afraid of being poor that you forgot how to value anything that couldn't be measured in dollars. You became exactly what your grandfather's family was trying to escape, someone who looks down on people who choose service over profit. My mother was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the photographs of the grandfather I'd never known. He looks like you, she whispered. Around the eyes. Mom, I said gently, I'm not here to destroy your life. I'm not here for revenge. But things are going to have to change. I pulled out the legal documents that Patricia had prepared. The house belongs to me now. Legally, you've been living here as my guest for 12 years, though you didn't know it. I could ask you to leave, but I'm not going to do that. The relief on my mother's face was palpable, but my father remained suspicious. However, I continued, you're going to have to accept some new realities. First, I'm going to be using part of this inheritance to fund my graduate education and to establish a scholarship program for students who want to pursue careers in social service. That's non-negotiable. Ryan, my father started. Second, I said, cutting him off, I'm going to be converting part of this house into office space for a non-profit organization. Grandma's letter mentions that she always intended this house to be used for community service, and that's what's going to happen. You can't just take over our home, my father said. It's not your home, Dad. It's my home and it always has been. But I'm offering to share it with you if you can accept that things are going to be different. My mother wiped her eyes. What do you mean different? I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to say would either bridge the gap between us or make it permanent. I mean that if you want to continue living in this house, you're going to have to accept that your son is a social worker. You're going to have to accept that I'm going to use this inheritance to help people, not to build the kind of traditional success you wanted for me. And you're going to have to acknowledge that the comfortable life you've been living for the past 12 years was funded by money that was meant to support exactly the kind of work you've been trying to talk me out of. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 22 years of expectations and disappointments, fears and love that had gotten twisted into something unrecognizable. Finally, my father spoke. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, he said quietly. But she was also stubborn and manipulative, and she held grudges. Maybe, I said. But she was also right about what matters in life. And she was right about you, Dad. You did let your fear control your decisions about my future. I wanted you to be secure. I wanted you to never worry about money the way I did when I was young. And now I don't have to worry about money, I said. I have enough to pursue the career I want and to help other people do the same. Isn't that what you actually wanted for me? Security and the ability to help others. My mother reached across the space between us and took my hand. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry we said those things in court. I'm sorry we made you feel like our love was conditional. Was it? I asked. Conditional, I mean? She squeezed my hand. No, honey. It wasn't. We were scared and angry and we said things we didn't mean. You are our child, no matter what career you choose, no matter what we said in that courtroom. I looked at my father, who was still staring at the photographs of his own father. Dad. He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw past the mask of control he always wore. I saw the 8-year-old boy who had lost his father, the teenager who had been ashamed of his family's poverty, the man who had spent his entire adult life trying to build walls against the fear of not being good enough. I'm proud of you, he said so quietly I almost didn't hear him. I don't understand your choices, but I'm proud of the man you've become. Your grandmother would be proud too. She left a letter for you, I said, pulling out the unsent letter from the box. She wrote it when you turned 18, but she never gave it to you. I think she hoped you'd figure it out on your own. He read it silently, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. I'm sorry, son, he said. I'm sorry I let my fears become your prison. I'm sorry I tried to make you live my dreams instead of your own. I forgive you, I said, and I meant it. But Dad, I need you to understand that forgiveness doesn't mean going back to the way things were. It means moving forward differently. He nodded. What do you need from us? I need you to trust me to build a good life even if it looks different from what you imagined. I need you to support my choices or at least not actively work against them. And I need you to understand that this house, this inheritance, is going to be used for the purpose Grandma intended to help people. What about us? My mother asked. Where do we fit in your plans? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. You fit wherever you want to fit as long as you can accept who I really am. The scholarship program I'm going to establish will need administrators. The nonprofit work will need people who understand how to navigate institutional systems. If you want to be part of it, there's a place for you. You want us to help you give away money to poor kids so they can become social workers? My father asked, and I couldn't tell if he was appalled or amused. I want you to help me honor the legacy that Grandpa died trying to build and that Grandma spent her life protecting, I said. I want you to help me turn this inheritance into something that makes the world a little better. My father was quiet for a long moment, looking around the living room where he'd spent the past 12 years thinking he was building security for his family, not knowing that the security was actually coming from the very values he'd tried to teach me to abandon. It's ironic, isn't it? He said finally. I spent your whole life trying to protect you from ending up like my father, and your grandmother spent hers making sure you'd have the resources to become exactly like him. Maybe, I said. But maybe the difference is that now I get to choose. I get to become like him by choice, not by circumstance. And if we can't accept your choices? My mother asked quietly. If this is too hard for us? I looked at both of them, these people who had raised me and loved me and tried to shape me into someone I wasn't, and I felt a sadness that was mixed with hope. Then you'll have to leave, I said. Because I'm not going to spend the rest of my life fighting for your approval of who I am. I'm going to build the life I want, with or without you. But I hope it's with you. As the late afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the house that had always been mine without my knowing it, we sat together surrounded by the evidence of secrets and love, fear and hope, mistakes and possibilities. It wasn't the ending to our story that any of us had expected. But maybe, I thought, it was the beginning of something better. My grandmother had been right about a lot of things. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give our family is the courage to be ourselves, even when it disappoints them. But sometimes, if we're very lucky, being ourselves gives them permission to be better than they thought they could be too. 6 months later, I was standing in what used to be my parents' formal dining room, watching a contractor explain to my mother how we could convert the space into a conference room for the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same woman who had once insisted that dinner be served on fine china was now enthusiastically discussing the installation of a projector and wheelchair-accessible furniture. "We'll need to widen this doorway," the contractor was saying, "and install proper electrical for the AV equipment. But the bones of the room are solid. It'll make a beautiful meeting space." My mother nodded, making notes on her tablet with the same focus she'd once brought to planning dinner parties. "What about soundproofing? We'll be meeting with scholarship recipients and their families, and we want them to feel comfortable sharing their stories." It had taken 3 months for my parents to fully accept the reality of our new situation. 3 months of difficult conversations, family therapy sessions that Susan Torres had recommended, and slowly rebuilding trust that had been shattered in a courthouse hallway. My father had been the harder sell, predictably. The man who had disowned me for wanting to pursue social work had struggled with the concept of using a multi-million-dollar inheritance to fund exactly that kind of work. But somewhere between reviewing scholarship applications and meeting with the young people we were supporting, something had shifted in him. "Ryan," he called from the kitchen where he was reviewing financial reports with our accountant. "Can you come look at these numbers?" I found him bent over spreadsheets, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, looking more engaged than I'd seen him since he'd taken early retirement from the insurance company 3 months earlier. "The first round of scholarships is fully funded," he said, pointing to a column of figures. 25 students, covering full tuition plus living expenses for 4 years each. "But look at this, we're getting more applications than we expected." He pulled up another document on his laptop. "We've received over 300 applications for next year's scholarships. All of them are kids from low-income families who want to pursue careers in social service. Teachers, counselors, social workers, community organizers." I looked at the numbers, feeling that familiar surge of excitement and responsibility that came with realizing how much good we could do with my grandmother's gift. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we expand the program," he said. "We have the resources. The foundation's investments have performed well, and the overhead costs are lower than projected because your mother has turned into some kind of organizational wizard." "Did someone mention my organizational wizardry?" my mother asked, appearing in the doorway with paint samples. "We need to choose colors for the scholarship recipient interview room. I'm thinking something warm but professional." She'd thrown herself into the foundation work with the same intensity she'd once brought to running her school district. In the past 6 months, she'd developed application processes, interview protocols, and support systems for scholarship recipients that were being studied by other foundations across the country. "Dad wants to expand the scholarship program," I told her. "Of course he does," she said, smiling at him with an affection I hadn't seen between them in years. "He's been reading applications until 2 in the morning and crying over every rejection letter we have to send." "I don't cry," my father protested, but his face softened. These kids, Ryan. They remind me of my father. They remind me of why he came to this country. That had been the real turning point for my father, not the money or the legal documents, but the scholarship applications themselves. Stories of teenagers who wanted to become teachers in underserved communities, young adults who'd grown up in foster care and wanted to become social workers, immigrants' children who wanted to provide counseling services in their native languages. "Tell me about the expansion idea," I said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs that had become our informal office space. My father pulled out a folder thick with applications. "What if we didn't limit ourselves to traditional 4-year college programs? What if we also funded community college programs, certification courses, graduate degrees for people who are already working in social services but need additional training?" "That's a big expansion," I said. "It's what your grandmother would have wanted," my mother said quietly. "Remember what she wrote in that letter? She didn't just fund 4-year degrees. She helped people get whatever education they needed to serve their communities." I thought about the documents we'd found in the basement, the records of my grandmother's quiet generosity over decades. She'd been right that family history was more complex and beautiful than my father had ever told me. And she'd been right about something else too. Sometimes people need to lose something precious before they understand its true value. "What would it cost?" I asked. My father grinned, and I realized I hadn't seen him look this excited about anything in years. To fully fund what I'm proposing? About $800,000 annually. We can afford that, I said. Especially if the foundation keeps growing the way it has been. There's something else, my mother said, setting down her paint samples. I've been talking to some of the scholarship recipients, and they've given me an idea. She pulled out her own folder, this one filled with photographs and testimonials. What if we didn't just fund their education? What if we created a network, a community of people who've been supported by the foundation? Alumni who mentor current recipients, graduates who come back to speak at events, professionals who offer internships and job placements. A pipeline, I said, understanding immediately. From scholarship to career to community leadership. Exactly. Your grandmother spent her life creating individual opportunities for people. What if we created a system that multiplies those opportunities exponentially? I looked at my parentes, really looked at them, and saw something I hadn't seen since I was a child. They were happy. Not the careful, controlled happiness of people who were managing their image or meeting expectations, but the deep satisfaction that comes from doing work that matters. Let's do it, I said. All of it. The expanded scholarships, the network, whatever else you two dream up. This is what the money is for. My mother came over and hugged me, something she'd been doing more often since our reconciliation. Your grandmother would be so proud, she whispered. She'd probably also be laughing at how long it took us to figure it out, my father said dryly. A knock at the front door interrupted our planning session. I opened it to find Maya Santiago, one of our first scholarship recipients, standing on the porch with a young girl who couldn't have been more than 16. Ryan, Maya said, grinning. I hope we're not interrupting. I wanted you to meet my little sister, Carmen. Carmen, this is Ryan Mitchell, the guy I told you about. Carmen stepped forward shyly, clutching a folder to her chest. She had Maya's dark eyes but none of her confidence. Thank you for helping my sister, she said quietly. She says you made it possible for her to become a teacher. The foundation made it possible, I corrected gently. But your sister made it happen through her own hard work. Carmen's graduating from high school this year, Maya explained. She wants to apply for a foundation scholarship, but she's nervous about the application process. What do you want to study? My mother asked, appearing behind me with the warmth she'd always shown to young people. Carmen's face lit up. Social work. I want to work with families, help kids who are going through what Maya and I went through when we were little. I looked at Maya, who nodded. Foster care, she said simply. Multiple placements, some good, some not so much. Carmen aged out of the system 2 years ago, but she's been living with me while she finishes high school. And you want to help other kids in similar situations? My father asked, joining us in the foyer. Carmen nodded eagerly. There are so many kids who don't have someone like Maya looking out for them. I want to be that person for them. My father and I exchanged a look. This was exactly why we were expanding the program, exactly the kind of young person my grandmother had envisioned helping. Have you started your application? My mother asked. Carmen held up her folder. I have everything except the personal essay. I keep starting it, but I don't know how to explain everything. Without making people feel sorry for me, you know? I don't want pity. I want a chance. Come on, my mother said, taking Carmen's arm. Let's sit down and talk about your story. Not the sad parts, the parts that show your strength and your vision for helping others. As they settled into the living room, Maya pulled me aside. This is amazing what you've built here. But I have to ask, why social work? You could have used this inheritance for anything. You could have started a business, traveled the world, bought a mansion. Why choose the hardest possible way to help people? It was a question I'd been asked a lot over the past 6 months by reporters covering our story, by other philanthropists interested in our model, by friends who couldn't understand why I'd choose a career that would never make me wealthy when I was already wealthy. Because it's not about the money, I said. The money is just a tool. What matters is the work, the connections, the individual moments when you help someone realize they have power to change their own life. Like what happened to you, Maya said. Like what happened to my whole family, I corrected. 6 months ago we were strangers living in the same house, held together by expectations and obligations and fear. Now we're actually working together toward something we all believe in. Through the window, I could see Carmen beginning to relax as my mother guided her through her story, helping her see the strength in her experiences rather than just the pain. In the kitchen, my father was on the phone with the contractor, discussing timeline for converting more of the house into foundation offices. Your grandmother planned all this, didn't she? Maya asked. She knew exactly how it would play out. I think she hoped, I said. But she also knew it could have gone differently. My parents could have fought the will. They could have refused to accept my choices. They could have moved out and cut contact entirely. But they didn't. No, they didn't. And I think that's the real miracle here. Not the money, not the foundation, but the fact that people can change. That families can heal. That love can survive disappointment and grow stronger on the other side. As the afternoon wore on, more scholarship recipients stopped by. It had become a regular occurrence, young people dropping in to share updates on their studies, ask for advice, or simply spend time in a place where their dreams were taken seriously. Marcus, no, I caught myself. One of our recipients, James, brought his girlfriend to meet us. She was a pre-med student who wanted to specialize in community health. Another student, Isabella, came to show us her acceptance letter to graduate school. A third, Antonio, brought his mother, who wanted to thank us in Spanish while tears streamed down her face. By evening, the house was full of young people and their families, sharing food that someone had brought, discussing classes and internships and career plans. My parents moved through the crowd with ease, my mother helping a freshman navigate her course schedule while my father explained fellowship opportunities to a junior who wanted to work in policy advocacy. It's like a family reunion, I said to Susan Torres, who had stopped by after finishing her own work at the public defender's office. It's better than a family reunion, she replied. Family reunions are about where you came from. This is about where you're all going. Later, after everyone had gone home and my parents had retired to their rooms upstairs, I sat alone in the living room looking at the photographs and documents from my grandmother's metal box. I'd framed some of them, pictures of my grandfather teaching English to immigrant children, my grandmother volunteering at community centers, both of them at various charity events and fundraisers over the years. There was one photograph I'd discovered just recently, tucked behind others in the back of the box. It showed my grandmother as a young woman, probably in her 20s, standing in front of a building with a sign that read, Settlement House. She was surrounded by children of various ethnicities, all of them smiling at the camera. On the back, in her careful handwriting, she'd written, "The work chooses you as much as you choose the work." Eleanor, 1954-inch. I'd been thinking about those words a lot lately, especially as I watched my parents discover their own calling in foundation work, as I saw scholarship recipients find their paths toward service, as I experienced firsthand how helping others had become the most fulfilling work I'd ever done. Maybe that was my grandmother's greatest gift, not the money, not the house, not even the opportunity to pursue my dreams without financial worry. Maybe her greatest gift was showing me that the work of making the world better was its own reward, that building something meaningful with the people you love was worth any amount of conflict or disappointment. My phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "Thank you for today. I submitted my application. For the first time, I'm not afraid of my story. I'm proud of it." I smiled, thinking about the shy girl who had arrived that afternoon and the confident young woman who had left, ready to pursue her dream of helping other kids navigate the foster system. That was the real miracle of the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation, not that we were funding education, but that we were helping people see their own strength, their own potential, their own power to make a difference. 6 months ago, I had walked out of a courthouse believing that I was no longer anyone's child, that I had lost my family in the process of becoming myself. Now I understood that I had actually found my family, not just in the reconciliation with my parents, but in the growing community of young people who were committed to service, in the network of professionals who were mentoring and supporting each other, in the legacy of my grandmother and grandfather that connected all of us across generations. The work chooses you as much as you choose the work. My grandmother had been right about that, just as she'd been right about so many other things. And as I sat in her house, my house surrounded by the evidence of lives being changed and futures being built, I knew that I had finally found my place in the world. I was no longer my parents' version of their child. But I had become something better, a person who was building something meaningful with the resources and opportunities I'd been given, someone who was honoring the past while creating a better future. And for the first time in my life that felt like enough. 1 year later. The Eleanor Mitchell Foundation's first annual scholarship gala was held in the ballroom of Chicago's Palmer House Hotel, the same venue where my grandmother had attended charity events decades earlier. As I stood at the podium looking out at the crowd of scholarship recipients, their families, donors, and community leaders, I could almost feel her presence in the room. 1 year ago, I began, I thought I knew what family meant. I thought I knew what success looked like. I thought I knew what it meant to be independent. In the front row, my parents sat with Maya Santiago and her sister Carmen, who had just completed her first semester as a social work major. Behind them, dozens of scholarship recipients in caps and gowns from their recent graduations smiled up at me. I was wrong about all of those things, I continued. Family isn't just the people who share your DNA. Success isn't just about what you achieve for yourself. And independence isn't about cutting yourself off from others, it's about choosing to build something meaningful with the people who matter to you. The applause was warm, genuine, filled with the energy of people who understood that we were celebrating more than academic achievements. We were celebrating the power of second chances, of families healing, of young people getting opportunities to build the futures they dreamed of. Later, as the evening wound down and people began to leave, I found myself standing with my parents on the hotel's balcony, looking out over the Chicago skyline. Your grandmother would have loved this, my mother said, slipping her arm through mine. She did love it, I replied. She just loved it 40 years before we figured out how to make it happen. My father, who had spent the evening talking earnestly with scholarship recipients about career planning and financial literacy, looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. I owe you an apology, son, he said quietly. Dad, we've been over this. No, let me say this. He turned to face me fully. I spent so many years being afraid that you'd end up struggling like my father did that I forgot the most important thing my father taught me, that a life spent helping others is never a wasted life. He'd be proud of you now, I said. Both of you. He'd be proud of all of us, my mother added, including his grandson who had the courage to disappoint his parents in order to honor his grandparents' legacy. As we stood there together, looking out over the city where 3 generations of our family had worked to build something better for others, I realized that my grandmother's final gift hadn't been the money or the house or even the foundation itself. Her final gift had been showing us that love, real love, isn't about control or conditions or making people into who we think they should be. Real love is about giving people the resources and support they need to become who they're meant to be, even when that person is different from what we expected, even when it scares us, even when it requires us to change too. In the courtroom, my parents had said I was no longer their child. But in the end, losing me as the child they tried to create had allowed them to find me as the son I actually was. And that, I thought as we made our way home to the house where my grandmother's legacy lived on, was the most valuable inheritance of all.